To our final day of this National Crime and Rights Week webinar. I'm your host, Jordan DeGraff, and we're coming to you live from HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. And today we're actually having one of their agents do a presentation about human trafficking. Human trafficking has been a big part of the discussion this week. If you were here on Monday, you were able to see the roundtable discussion that we had with an agent from HSI and two nonprofits from this area who help victims of human trafficking. We also talked a little bit about it yesterday during the presentation. But if you couldn't make it to those, you can always watch them back on YouTube or on Facebook. So thank you once again for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today, and you will be able to see the slideshow that's put together for this. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Sean Murphy. I'm a special agent with Homeland Security Investigations based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And like Jordan said, we're going to talk a little bit about human trafficking today. Go ahead, Jordan, starts off. All right, so before we begin and get into the crux of it all, we'll talk a little bit about HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, and who we are and what we do. We are the main investigative arm of DHS. We focus a lot on the comings and goings in and out of the country. So we investigate transnational crime and other threats and organizations who exploit the global infrastructure through the international trade, travel, and finance systems. Our mission is to investigate and disrupt and dismantle terrorist, transnational, and other criminal organizations that threaten or seek to exploit customs and immigration laws of the United States. We have over 10,000 employees. That includes investigators, special agents, intelligence people, analysts, mission support personnel, with about 7,000 of those being special agents. We have a presence in over 220 cities throughout the country, and I believe we are in 62 is the number of other countries where we have a footprint across the world. So we have a pretty far reach to try to follow the crime as it comes and goes in and out of the country. So we handle a lot of different programmatic areas, a lot of narcotics smuggling, money laundering. You can see them all listed there. Child exploitation, gangs, labor exploitation, human smuggling, human trafficking, arms trafficking, benefit fraud, identity fraud, other financial crimes, things like that, terrorism, human rights violations, war crimes, and cultural property, art, and antiquities smuggling. Okay, so what we're all here to talk about, human trafficking. So the mission is to identify criminal organizations engaged in the trafficking and smuggling of humans, and to investigate those groups that pose the greatest risk to the United States. HSI is the leader in the fight against human trafficking. I would say, as an agency, we probably handle more human trafficking than most other or all other federal agencies. So here we are, back to this. So again, 62 international offices on every continent except Antarctica. And again, the number of agents has grown since this map was created. It's now, I think, about 7,100. Okay, so what is human trafficking? It is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor services through force, fraud, or coercion. So human trafficking is broken down into two types, right? There's labor, which is what I just read to you, and sex. So sex trafficking is a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Now the caveat to that in the United States Code is that if that person is a juvenile, if they are under the age of 18 years old, you do not need to prove the elements of force, fraud, or coercion. simply the fact that they are a child, any involvement in commercial sex involving that child makes it sex trafficking. Human trafficking is a global reality. Slavery still very much exists in the world today, both in labor trafficking, which often takes kind of a form of what they used to call indentured servitude, and also sex trafficking as well. It is everywhere across the world. It's in the United States. It's in big cities, small towns. And are networks and organizations that seek to benefit for monetary gain at the exploitation of other people. I think it's important in the media today, the term human trafficking gets thrown out a lot, especially when people start talking about issues on the United States southern border. I think it's important to sort of differentiate what is human smuggling and what is human trafficking. Okay, smuggling is actually a crime against the border. The fact that there is a line between two countries, right, and it is illegal to bring something across that line outside the confines of the law, that is smuggling, right? It is transportation based. Something cannot be smuggled if it's not moving, right? It requires border crossing. Now, when you're talking about human smuggling, more often than not, that will be voluntary. The person who is being smuggled is traditionally a willing participant in their movement across that border. In fact, many of them are paying a lot of money in order to gain assistance in crossing the border. With that said, even though they are voluntarily being smuggled, it does oftentimes open them up for various forms of exploitation, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Conversely, trafficking, we hear the word traffic, and we instantly think like we're sitting in traffic. But trafficking does not require movement. Someone can be trafficked in one spot, even in their own home. Trafficking is a crime against a person. It is exploitation based, and like I said, it is not necessary for them to cross any border for them to be trafficked. In fact, most of the identified victims in the United States year after year are U.S. citizens. But the difference here is the voluntariness, right? So someone may actually want to be smuggled to try to get where they want to go. Trafficking is going to be involuntary. They are being, through some means of force, fraud, or coercion, forced to do something that they are not wanting to do. There's a little illustrative way to show the difference in trafficking. And these are real photos. So smuggling, they're trying to hide in order to cross a boundary. Trafficking can look as simple as somebody working in a field, or someone who's not free to move. Their freedoms have been freedom of movement has been restricted. So as I mentioned before, human smuggling, it can open people up to a lot of different forms of victimization, right? It is not uncommon to see hostage taking, kidnapping, extortion schemes, and other forms of assault. There are people who all along their journey to come from wherever they're coming from to get in the United States, some of them have endured sex crimes just as they're moving in a group. They're repeatedly victimized by those they're traveling with. They continue their journey anyway. Hostage taking, a lot of people there. I've actually seen an uptick in this, past couple of years. But even like fake hostage takings, where someone will hire a group to facilitate their smuggling, and then they'll come into the country and they'll come to a safe house before they're taken where they ultimately want to go. And the people who are running the safe house will cut off all communication with their family and start extorting the family who remains down south for extra fees. They'll take the person's phone away, just hold them in a house for a week, and then they'll start messaging the family, "You need to wire some more money, or your family member is going to be harmed." I've seen an uptick in that over the past couple of years, like I said. However, even though we may have these aggravating factors up to and including violence, that alone does not make it trafficking. It just makes it an elevated, aggravated crime of smuggling. So some behavioral indicators when you are, or speaking from a victim standpoint. Correction, no. For the traffickers, traffickers are very controlling. They thrive on isolation, isolating a victim. So they don't want other people near the group of victims. They control every aspect of that victim's life. They will oftentimes control the flow of drugs. A lot of people who are sex trafficking victims have substance abuse issues. One of the means with which a trafficker can control them is by controlling their access to the drugs that they are addicted to. Forced drug use can sometimes happen. They will invoke rights of victims without victims' knowledge. I had a case where the trafficker was able to get his name put on the birth certificate to get parental rights to the victim's child. And that was a huge source of control in that particular case. So yeah, they look for any and all means of control. Sometimes it's physical force, and they like isolation. They don't want people with a strong social circle, so that they're less apt to reach out for help that way. So they like people that are already sort of isolated. It makes them an easier victim. But even if that's not the case, they will seek to isolate them, or not let them have any access to their family members, access to phones, things like that. Cut them off from friends, just kind of shrink their social circle. Victims are often refuse to speak to law enforcement. Some of them have a distrust of law enforcement. There have been there's always sort of been the thought in law enforcement for many years that people engaged in commercial sex were doing it voluntarily. So I think that lack of understanding has bolstered a mistrust of law enforcement. They may not see law enforcement as someone who has the ability to help them. And sometimes it's a coached response. And sometimes there's fear attached to that. If I don't say that everything's okay, I'm going to be in trouble with my trafficker. Victims often may not have identification. They can give a fake name to law enforcement that way, and that way, if they are listed as a missing person, that may go undetected. It's also, without identification, it's harder to get access to any benefits through state programs and things like that. So that is yet another source of isolation and control for a trafficker, by refusing them to let them have identification. When you're talking about labor trafficking, a lot of people, they won't be able to tell you how much they earn, or they don't know what happens to their money. And sometimes it can look like, oh, my boss just has refused to pay me. Sex trafficking victims sometimes won't know how much they're supposed to earn from a date, especially if the trafficker is the one sort of arranging things. And a lot of them won't have any money in their possession because it all goes to the trafficker. And there at the bottom again, forbidden to socialize, right? Traffickers like to isolate them from their social circle, as I said earlier. All right, so what does this look like? Sex trafficking and prostitution are almost always linked. Someone who may be engaged in prostitution is much more likely to be victimized. They're already engaged in that life. They already have, generally speaking, their own demons they're fighting that make them easier to control and easier for a trafficker to gain control of them. Street-based prostitution and pimps. If you hear the term pimp, which is all over our culture these days, and different songs and whatnot, the term pimp is synonymous with sex trafficker. Truck stops are rife for this type of thing. You'll see traffickers will take girls to truck stops and have them just go truck to truck. Sometimes they'll do it over CB radio, and make arrangements that way. The internet is a huge factor in commercial sex and sex trafficking. There are escort websites. Backpage was a big one. I'm sure many of you have probably heard about Backpage. It ultimately was seized and taken down. But there's a lot of different ones out there. There's Skip the Games, City X Guide, Plenty of Fish. Those are a few of them. There's many others. Mega Personals and Erotic Monkey, all kinds of things. And there's a whole world to that too. There's review sites where customers can talk about certain sex workers they've had contact with, and so the internet plays a huge role in perpetuating sex trafficking. All right, so indicators. So a victim will be controlled typically by a pimp or sometimes a bottom girl. A bottom girl is typically someone who was a victim of the pimp who has seen a way to sort of better her situation within that pimp's organization. So she will take on the role of arranging dates, collecting money, making sure the girls are ready, handling a lot of the other victims. And as a result, sometimes there are sort of perks that come with that job. Maybe less aggression from pimp, or maybe she doesn't have to do as many dates, something along those lines. So she's sort of found a way to better her situation within the confines of that organization. Threats to the sex workers' family and children, that's pretty common. I mentioned the one guy, and that was actually back on the East Coast, where he had parental rights to her child. So there's nothing law enforcement can do if he decided to just take the kid and go. He was listed as dad. So that was a huge source of control for him. Moving victims around city to city. I said earlier that trafficking does not require movement, but oftentimes it includes movement. It's referred to as a circuit. So different areas of the country have a different circuit. Here, what I tend to see is maybe Albuquerque to Las Vegas, maybe out to LA, back through Phoenix, something along those lines. Back east, it's huge up the 95 corridor. There's just so many big cities there. So you may see like, New York City, Atlantic City, Philadelphia, and back up and down, maybe down to Baltimore, and, back up and down the 95 corridor was very, very common. Again, drugs are a source of control, whether the trafficker gets the victim addicted to drugs or if they already came with that addiction prior to meeting the trafficker. Either way, controlling the flow of drugs, people will do a lot of things in order to feed those addictions. It's a big driving force. So part of that isolation is they don't let them get their feet under them in any way. So they don't have an ID, so they can't get access to different benefits. They won't have access to any transportation if it's not moving with the pimp. They won't have access to money, so they can't buy a bus ticket to get back home. No cell phone, so they're not talking to family. Just kind of stripping them of everything that might give them a little bit of traction to get out. Oftentimes, victims won't be the ones posting their own ads. It will be the trafficker or sometimes the bottom girl. And then minors, right? Minors that are running around with, traveling city to city with someone who they have no familial connection to, things like that. I think last year, the average age of a identified victim within the United States was 15 years old. So it's very common. Minors are often targets, especially when they have very poor support structure and home life. Many of them have been subjected to different abuse in the home, so they run away. Runaways are highly, highly susceptible to becoming trafficking victims. Minors are looking for love, support, acceptance, and if they're not getting that with people they should be getting it from, their caretakers, parents, whomever it may be, they may look to someone else for that, and a pimp can very well start to play that role to gain that trust, and then ultimately lead them down the path of sex trafficking. Skip the games. It's an escort website. I think the use of that in the COVID era sort of changed. There's still a lot of massage parlor ads on there and things like that. But I think there's been some others that have surged up. But Skip the Games is a great example of all these sites. So a lot of times when they're making posts, they'll use fake photos, fake ages. They'll use phone numbers that are hard to track for us. A lot of them are app based or some text application. They'll use IP addresses from open Wi-Fi's and things like that. Skip the Game is a good example. You can post ads for free, and payment has changed too over the years. It used to be kind of cash upon a face-to-face meet. Now there's a lot of cash apps, Venmo, Cash App, PayPal, all these types of things where people can get a deposit up front, things like that. Voice over IP numbers, burner phones, throwaway phones, switching out SIM cards. All these things are kind of ways that traffickers try to avoid detection by law enforcement. massage parlors, they are quite commonly used for commercial sex. So mostly all of them are Asian. Around here where we are, almost all of the people in them are of Chinese descent. Many of the people working there actually have valid immigration statuses, and most of them have come into the country, and then they've come into the country into Los Angeles, and then come from there. Um, and I think Los Angeles is a huge hub for this kind of in the western part of the country. Back east, a lot of the girls you would see in massage parlors, they would be coming through Flushing, New York, was a big hub out east for that. There are actually employment agencies set up that they are supplying different massage parlors with a supply of masseuses. A lot of these agencies are based in Los Angeles. These cases are tough. It's tough for a couple of reasons. So the masseuses are sort of operating as independent contractors. So there's a little bit of plausible deniability, if you will, of the person running front of house. They can say, I don't know what was happening in that room. I collected the house fee, and they're working for tips. And those tips are generally going to be linked to services rendered and what someone is going to perform. There's also language barrier issues and cultural issues. There's sometimes a distrust from law enforcement based largely in how law enforcement operates in their home countries. Things like that can kind of be big hurdles in overcoming when you work in those cases. Social media, big for recruitment. Pimps will they troll these sites and they look for possible victims, right? They'll recruit, they'll message them through these different social media sites and offer them jobs as models or something like that. I'm a photographer. I'd love to take your picture. All these sorts of things. But yeah, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Tinder, and other dating sites. They'll arrange a date with someone, and then that date will be a way to get access to that victim. Kick, and they very, very common. They look for again victims. If you look at their social media, a lot of times you can tell who doesn't have a strong social circle, and they'll be very selective about who they're targeting. Bottom girls, again, are sometimes recruiters for a pimp. Sometimes a victim. It's a little bit of a softer approach sometimes, where it's a girl approaching a potential victim about being engaged in commercial sex, as opposed to maybe a male who's rough around the edges. So it can be a little bit of a softer approach to kind of start to get a hook into that victim. So pimps can portray themselves as potential boyfriends, and the bottom girls are just their friends. So generally speaking, there's two types of pimps. Actually, I like to think there's maybe a third type too. And these pimps that can portray themselves as potential boyfriends, they're typically Romeo pimps. They will start a dating relationship with someone ultimately before coercing them into commercial sex acts. So Romeo pimp, and then a gorilla pimp is commonly just a very abusive, physically abusive a pimp. And I think what's probably The most common type that I see is actually a blend, and it's sort of a sliding scale. They'll start as a Romeo pimp until they kind of gain a little bit of trust, and then they'll switch into a gorilla pimp with forms of physical abuse at sort of the turning out stage. The turning out stage is kind of that pivotal moment where ultimately someone's going to be pushed into commercial sex. And again, applying them with drugs and alcohol. Again, especially targeting younger folks, where it might be a little bit harder to get booze. They can start offering them these things on these social media sites. Other areas that are vulnerable to trafficking activities. You can see them listed there. Exotic dance clubs, bars, nail salons, truck stops, hotels, houses and locations controlled by gangs. We don't really have much of that here in Albuquerque. There was some of that in Baltimore that I was aware of back east. I think Los Angeles has some of that going on as well. Bus stations and train stations. It's public transportation is a way to travel with your victims to different areas, and then areas frequented by runaway teens. There's just over 5,000 homeless teens in Albuquerque, and there are certain places where they kind of congregate, and they are a very, very vulnerable population. And I'd be willing to bet that there's many other cities with that same type of issue where there's a lot of runaway teens congregating in certain areas, and that is just ripe for the picking for a trafficker. They're looking for people with limited support structure, and runaways almost always that's the case. Labor trafficking. So labor trafficking, again, like nail salons, massage parlors, cantinas, a lot of them like in Texas, ranches, farms, things like that. Labor trafficking is sort of where we see sometimes a link to human smuggling. I used the phrase indentured servitude earlier. Sometimes, if someone doesn't have the money to pay the smuggling fee, someone will offer to pay it for them, and they just have to work off that debt. But the debt will be structured in a way where they will work and never be able to pay it off. Labor trafficking indicators, there can be actual lockdown situations where, you're just kept in a place where you're doing your work. No access to documents. Again, if someone has been smuggled in illegally, that's almost always the case. There's not going to be documentation there. Wage and hour violations. Again, my boss hasn't paid me in 2 weeks, or I'm supposed to be earning this much, and I'm only earning this much. They cut my wages for no reason. Things like that. Living and housing provided by the trafficker. Many times there's like maybe an apartment above a massage parlor where the victims will be staying. Or if it's a farm or a ranch, there's a house on the ranch where all the ranch hands will stay, something like that. And no independent access to transportation, right? The boss will take them everywhere. Oh, you have a medical issue, you're going to go with this person to the doctor, things like that. They can't really move freely on their own at all. Debt bondage, that's basically what I was talking about with, the smuggling fees and things like that is a perfect example. And then fraudulent job offers or job descriptions. They answer, an example could be you're answering an ad online for one job, and you get there and you're told it's going to be a different job and you're going to work 16 hours a day instead of 10 like we told you. And, if you leave, there's going to be consequences, things like that. So that's, you're promised one thing and it's not the job you're promised at Some of the vulnerable industries for labor trafficking, like I said, massage parlors, agriculture is a big one. Domestic servitude, yeah, cleaning people's houses, maintaining a workforce to clean houses, exotic dancers, servers, wait staff, things like that. You know, cash businesses and employees who are typically paid in cash. You can almost always find a way to facilitate labor trafficking through a business that's structured that way. So when we're looking at this, for the transportation industry, um, you see somebody traveling and they don't have identity documents, or someone else is holding their ID as they're traveling, right? And trying to answer for them when you're asking, hey, where are you going? Where are you heading? You want to look at who's paying for their airline ticket. Do they have a cell phone? Again, all these things that work toward that isolation. Um, maybe they only have a small amount of luggage and it doesn't really fit with how long they're supposedly going to be at their destination. They have a carry-on size bag and they're supposed to be going away for 3 weeks. And then I think I touched on that earlier again, minor that's traveling without anyone, without any companion at all, or traveling with someone that they don't have any, relationship with that you can tell. Some of this is getting a little specific to certain places because we'll do presentations like this at different venues. So hotels, casinos, truck stops, things like that. So that's why some of this is a little more specific. But casinos and hotels, even nice hotels, there is sex trafficking happening in the whole wide range of hotels, whether it's a roach motel in the worst part of town or the nicest hotel in the nicest part of town. It kind of runs the gamut. And casinos, they're also kind of prime target for sex trafficking. People are scratching vices at casinos. They're gambling, they're drinking. Some of them have other vices as well. So it's a kind of a lot of potential clients at a casino. So some things that we tell people that are working at these places to look for are some of these indicators. A female is kind of dressed, a little more scantily or a little more inappropriately, and they're approaching males as they're gambling or something like that. And you see them going from man to man to man. They're typically going to be trying to work some kind of deal. Especially if there's a dude who's paying attention to those females as they're going around, kind of watching who they're approaching. It's part of the control of the trafficker. Women who might be checking in to a hotel who, again, don't seem to be free to talk, or they start to appear fearful. Kind of trust your gut when you're evaluating that. Again, they don't have their IDs, they don't have a cell phone. Those are classic examples of how they're isolating people. Again, minors with no real relationship to who they're with. Some girl who looks like she's 15 or 16, she says, that's my boyfriend. He looks like he's 30. Yeah, that's highly suspect. And paying for hotel rooms in cash, and it's a male paying, and he's got women with him. Things like that are all potential indicators. A lot of times some of these escort sites will actually post like general areas where they are. And through chatting with them, they'll tell you what hotel they're in and things like that. If you see minors trying to check in, right, that's a problem, potentially alarming. Again, someone who appears to be, their actions are controlled by someone else. And a group of women together and one seems to be controlling everything. That's going to be your bottom girl, right? But if you get several girls all together trying to get into hotel rooms, it's potentially a trafficking situation. So quickly, the Department of Homeland Security has the Blue campaign, which is basically the effort to raise awareness about human trafficking, both sex and labor, and try to educate people about what it is and what we can do about it. So again, there's a lot of flyers and posters and little indicator cards that we'll pass out. We'll post up different places, and you can see examples of them there. They'll tell you, what number to call. Kind of try to just raise awareness, because a lot of times people will see something, they know that something's just not quite right, but they can't put their finger on it. And sometimes if we can just open their eyes to, hey, this is not a faraway land issue. It's not an immigration issue. It's a small town, big city, United States, everybody issue. So that's kind of the whole goal behind the Blue campaign. I mentioned indicator cards. There's an example of them there. It kind of draws the line again between what smuggling is and what trafficking is. Again, I think the media really muddies the water about what trafficking is. A lot of people think it's a border issue. Well, it's not. It's like I said, most identified victims in this country are United States citizens, and that average age is in the teens. So it is our families and our kids that are susceptible to this. And then, of course, on the back of the card, some of these indicators, many of which we've talked about here today. Homeland Security Investigations has a victim-centered approach. The well-being of the victim has to take precedent over the prosecution of the trafficker, which can make prosecution difficult. But we have a pretty robust victim assistance program that can plug victims into different things that they need. Through their trafficking experience, most of them have been cut off from access to even the most basic necessities. Some of them have serious medical issues going on. Some of them have, they all have mental health issues going on from the victimization. They have no way to get back to their family if they're hundreds of miles away. All of these things, they're going to need access to assistance, and that's where our victim assistance program comes in. Like I said, the victims are key to successful investigation and prosecution. If we don't get them stable enough to face their trafficker in court, the case will fall apart, right? So as a part of that, we have the VAPS, Victim Assistance Program, and victim assistance specialists whose aim is to plug them into all the things to help get them stable. It also identifies them helps the victim identify that they have rights linked to their victimization, right? Regardless of their legal status in an immigration realm or anything like that, they still have rights. So the victim assistance program is all aimed at getting them stable and getting them access to the things that they're entitled to. And right there is the crux of it at the bottom. It is not possible to have a credible, reliable witness until you have a victim who feels safe and secure. That is a true statement. So how HSI does that, we have people that specialize in meeting the needs of victims. So we have over 250 victim assistance coordinators, 23 victim assistance specialists, and forensic interviewers as well, which comes into play when you're dealing with sexual related crimes with younger victims, especially. So some resources for you all, if you want to take a picture of that or screenshot that. Tip reporting, there's a number for it, the National Trafficking Hotline, and the Blue Campaign. That is the Department of Homeland Security website for the Blue Campaign, where you can get access to some of those educational materials that I was referencing. I will say one caveat to this. If you see something you think is a trafficking situation, something that concerns you, you can report it to this tip line. If you see something that is an immediate safety concern, notify 911 and have them send local law enforcement. There have been instances where, because the tip lines come in for, we get tips, they come in, maybe the following day to us for further investigation of a potential crime. But if there's an immediate threat or immediate safety concern, call 911. Don't rely on the tip line, because again, by the time it goes through their processes, it comes to us. We need to make sure people are safe immediately. So 911 is the way to do that. There's another promotional banner for Homeland Security Investigations. It's who we are, what we do. And again, we're here to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle terrorist, transnational, and other criminal organizations that threaten to seek and exploit the customs and immigration laws of the United States. That is not my contact information. That is my wonderful boss's contact information. But that is him. So that is Supervisory Special Agent Morgan Langer. Again, my name is Special Agent Sean Murphy. It's been a pleasure to talk at you guys today. I hope you got something out of it. And I'm here for any questions if anybody has anything they want to ask.
Thank you, Sean. And we have several questions. So one of them is something you were explaining earlier between smuggling and trafficking. Many voluntary smuggling participants can become full-blown victims of trafficking.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So, and a lot of times you see it a lot in the labor realm. Not always. It can also be sex as well. But it's a lot in the labor trafficking realm. Like I said, a lot of times it looks like someone's covering a smuggling fee because someone can't afford it, and they structure it so, you'll just work it off at my uncle's farm up there or whatever. The next thing you know, you're working at a farm and you're never going to be able to pay off that debt. So it absolutely can lead to trafficking. It can lead to all types of different exploitation, trafficking being one of those forms. Sexual assault, hostage taking, extortion, extorting your family down south for more money, things like that. That happens quite often. But yes, you can absolutely become a trafficking victim post smuggling.
Thank you. Another one is asking if people who are smuggled are easier targets for the traffickers as they become trafficking victims.
I would say potentially in the labor realm. I think the prime target area for sex trafficking is at-risk youth, regardless of any link to smuggling. Now there are some investigative journalists who have been investigating, children that are trying to be smuggled in. They never make it here. They're left in Mexico somewhere. No one knows where they are anymore. There is, anytime you're sort of at the will of someone else, you're at a greater risk to be exploited in some way. But I would say for labor trafficking, I think a smuggled population would be easier to exploit in the labor trafficking realm. But I think generally speaking, for how we typically see traffickers here operating, sex traffickers here operating, the at-risk youth without a stable environment are their prime target-rich environment.
Thank you. Another question is there's some confusion. They've heard different things about whether large events have an uptick in trafficking or not. Different things, major events such as Super Bowl or sports events.
Yeah, there was some stuff floating around pre-Super Bowl. It's the biggest trafficking event. The fact of the matter is that sex trafficking happens all day, everywhere. Now, anytime you amass people in one area, there's more clientele available. So, it's not completely indifferent from, sex trafficking happens in small towns, but you may have more of it in a big city because there's more potential clients, right? Kind of the same principle. If you congregate people together, yes, it can be, it can have an uptick, but it's not necessarily causal, if that makes sense. The traffickers see, oh, there's going to be a lot of clientele in this, in this city for this event. Yeah, they may go and try to make some money that way, but it's not necessarily because of the event. It's just that there's a large pool of clientele. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Maybe. And if there needs to be a follow-up question on that, by
So
all
like
means.
demand
Yeah.
is just higher because
Yeah, exactly. Demand's higher because you have a large group of potential clients.
Someone else wants to ask, are there consistent characteristics of traffickers, certain groups, whether it be mob related or cartel related?
Read that to me one more time. Sorry.
Are there consistent characteristics of human traffickers? Like, are they mostly white, Protestants, or members of Italian mob, or cartels?
So I think that depends on where you are, right? Because it happens in all countries. So like, if I were to say that, it's more of a traffickers are typically cartel linked to Hispanic. Well, you go to Thailand, that's not going to be the case, right? So I think I think the one key characteristic would be narcissism. I think you will see narcissism as a linking trafficker. They don't have empathy. They just lack the ability. They put someone's well-being well below their money. So to have that mentality, I don't think I don't think there's a common physical characteristic per se. I think that's going to kind of depend on the demographic of the area you're in. But it's, they are willing to make other human beings endure things that they shouldn't have to endure just so they can earn money. So that sort of would be my answer for that, if that makes
Right.
sense.
So here in the United States,
Mhm.
you can't just look out in the big crowd and maybe be able to, especially with expertise, pick out someone that potentially is a trafficker.
It's all going to be behavioral based, right? The way they're interacting with people, the way people are interacting with them, right? Because a trafficker, their whole well-being is based upon they're stable, right? Which and that's a term for their victims, right? They have a stable of typically girls, but it can also be there can be male victims as well. But how that behavioral stuff would be the indicators that I might be able to pick out. Not necessarily a particular look, but behavioral stuff like I mentioned, in casinos. If I see a girl who's going from this guy at a slot machine to this guy at a craps table to this guy back at a slot machine over to this guy who's playing poker, going guy to guy to guy to guy to guy, she's shopping for a date. So that behavior makes me think, okay, she's in the commercial sex industry. So now I look at who might be displaying behavior that shows me a connection to her, someone who's over in the corner watching, or another girl she meets up with occasionally, and she's doing the same thing. So it's the behavior and the actions that would help me build a profile looking at it, but not just a physical appearance necessarily.
Thank you. And you mentioned that you teach or you give this information to people in the hospitality industry, like casinos, hotels. How does someone request this type of presentation for their business?
So, I mean, if you were here in northern New Mexico, I'd just say, hey, ask me, here's my cell. But HSI does a lot of them. Look up, depends on where you're located. Just look up what HSI office would cover your area and see if they can have someone come and talk about trafficking. Honestly, in the post-COVID world, stuff like this where, you said there were people from all over the country on this today. Nothing says we can't do it remotely either, and come kind of do the same type of thing with a different audience. So if there's somebody who wants to do something like that, like I said, Morgan's my boss. So the contact information that's up there, you could email Morgan if you had the ability to do something virtually, and he can get us in contact and we can work something out virtually. If not, if you'd rather it be in person, I would just hit up whatever local HSI office you have. And, some of the bigger offices have whole groups that just work trafficking, human trafficking. Like Baltimore has one, New York has one where it's, it might be like a whole group of people. So outreach is something they should be doing as part of the attempt to raise awareness as part of the Blue campaign. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And then this person has heard that there might be signs that victims use to get people's attention, like secret gestures. Is that a true statement?
I've heard things like that too. I think, I can't say definitively yes or no. I think that people were trying to start something like that so that maybe people could have a way to cry for help silently. I will say that with all the victims I've talked to, there are many, 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 many who will not identify as victims. They've been so manipulated, so just mentally abused, physically abused, to where even if they are sitting down in front of law enforcement and we're saying, look, we can get you to a safe house, no one will know where you are, all of these things, they still will not talk about it. Even not just talk about it, like, don't need to hear the whole story from them right then, right? You get them stable and then they can tell you the story. But when you're sitting face to face with someone that you know they're in a bad spot and they need help, and they will not take the help, it's very disheartening, very frustrating. But I bring that up to say I highly doubt you'll see a lot of victims using secret gestures as a cry for help when they won't even tell an entire organization with the ability to help them that they need help, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of the things that they have been subjected to as victims changes their outlook on things to where they're not looking at things the same way we would look at them, having not walked in their shoes. Many of them have been victimized by people their entire lives, and it's all they know. Some of them, and it makes them highly susceptible to be trafficking victims. And as a result, some of them, they don't know anything else, and they won't even accept help. It's just normal for them, and it's a horrible thing to say. But you can literally be sitting there with, saying, "Hey, I'll get you to safety. I promise no one will hurt you," and they still won't accept that offer. So I highly doubt that a secret handshake, so to speak, is going to be a cry for help when a lot of them won't accept help when it's offered.
Thanks, Sean. And then another question is, how does HSI deal with victims who may have also been committing crimes while they were being trafficked, such as maybe the following girls?
That's a case by case basis, and a lot of that. It's a case by case basis, right? So kind of depends on what the crime is. Some I've talked to girls who were concerned about getting in trouble for selling drugs because that's also what their trafficker was doing. And while they were with him, if they were selling drugs, they didn't have to do as many dates and things like that. So are we worried about that in a case like that? Absolutely not. Now, a bottom, it's sort of dependent, right? There can be a bottom that's just as bad as a main trafficker. Motivation for it is maybe their own safety. Maybe that's a leniency thing. So, and any decision about that actually goes through, in the federal side, goes through the U.S. Attorney's Office. So there's always a prosecutor who is going to ultimately decide who they think should charge, and it's again, a case by case basis based on all the different statements from the people involved, all the different evidence, all that stuff gets factored in. It's depending on what they've done. It's not. If they've been victimized, if they've been victimizing people and they get to the point where they're just as bad as a trafficker, they're instead of the trafficker hitting somebody, they're hitting somebody, that kind of stuff. I mean, yeah, they need the answer, but there's always kind of that sliding scale about the severity, and it's all just looking at the totality of all the facts.
Thank you. And we have two more questions. They're kind of related. I might have Morgan. I'm going to put you on the spot, Morgan, to answer the other one because you're wearing the shirt for the other one they're asking about how to become what's the process of becoming an agent. But first for you, Sean, how did you get into this line of work and what's your degree or background?
How did I get in this line of work? I'm really bad at math, so my brother's the banker. So I became a cop in early part of 2008, and I was a cop for about 11 years. Did some different stuff there, and then was fortunate enough to get hired on by HSI and sent out here, and Yeah, how did I get into this line of work? I suppose I always kind of wanted to. I guess I always, even from when I was a little kid, wanted to be a cop. I don't really know. And then I think as my police career progressed, I got into a lot of like special victim stuff, a lot of crimes against children, a lot of sex crimes, some homicide stuff like that. And I kind of just victim crimes kind of made sense to me, I guess. And so I'm kind of fortunate that I got to come on board here and work victim-related crimes from a different capacity. So I guess I'm just fortunate.
Thanks. Morgan, do you want to come up and say anything about the process of becoming an HSI agent? Maybe say what you're doing later today. Say what's local.
Just stand here. Is this good?
Yeah.
Hey, I see your head, boss.
Podium?
Are you doing is that what you're doing there?
That's part of what we're doing. So,
All right. So
Perfect. Yep.
so how to become an HSI Special Agent? There's no one set path. A lot of times we look for people like Sean who have prior law enforcement experience, although that's not a requirement. Like any federal job, you have to go to the USA Jobs website and look for the job. So you apply through USA Jobs. If you have more questions or whatever for that, I don't know if my email is still up there, but you're welcome to email me, and I can try to, I can send you the link if you're not familiar with USA Jobs. If you want to send me your resume, I can give you some feedback. But yeah, we look for a lot of like former law enforcement. We seem to hire a lot of former military, but there's not any one path to become an HSI Special Agent. And it is very competitive. For every one position, certainly probably thousands of people put in. Sometimes we'll have recruitment job announcements for specific demographics. So we'll look for maybe specifically current law enforcement, people that are specifically current DHS or Department of Homeland Security employees. We had a recent announcement for women. We have a hard time recruiting women at all phases of the agency. So we do that later today, or actually right now, but I'll be heading out to the Gathering of Nations event at the fairgrounds, the Mexico State Fairgrounds, the Expo de Mexico building. And we have a table there, a booth, and we'll be doing recruitment and also some of our other program areas. We'll be talking to people. So if you want to go to Gathering of Nations, I'll be there until 8 tonight, starting. I'll get there around 2. Be happy to talk to you in person there as well. But does that answer it, Jordan?
yes, perfect. Thanks so much,
Thank
Morgan.
you.
And I don't know if you want to say anything in closing.
I was just going to say that was so much more articulate than I would have made it. So, yeah, thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Sean, thank you so much for presenting today. And Morgan, thank you. And I just want to thank everyone here at Homeland Security Investigation for hosting us, for being so courteous and kind. And thank you for joining us. If you missed one of the days, you can certainly go back and watch them on YouTube. And we hope we're progressing as we do these events. Maybe next year we'll be able to do a more live event with actual audience to talk about crime victims' rights in 2023. Thanks so much for joining us. Visit our website, cyrprice.org, for more information where you can watch the webinars played back. Again, thank you. Have a nice day and a great weekend.
That's all.
Okay.
Hey, Sean.
Yay.
Yeah. I sound like I'm drooling all over myself.
Morgan, you want me to